Let's talk about voice, shall we? First of all, thanks for coming to my session. This is way more people than I expected to come to an outlier type of conversation. No pun intended. But my name is Heather Downing, and I flew all the way from Kansas City, Missouri, which is in the dead center of the United States, where we first got a glimpse of Google Fiber. We were the experimental city for that. So for quite some time, I've gotten to work with both Amazon and Google as to the new kinds of prototypes that they came out with. And I'm so pleased to have spent the past almost 2 years building prototypes for both of these devices. So, how many of you here have actually built a voice skill in the room? Okay, a couple of you. So you're already ahead of the curve. I got to a chance to give a presentation on this in Oslo a little bit earlier last year. And it was amazing to me how many people within 24 to 48 hours of the presentation were emailing me with all sorts of questions because they didn't have any questions at the time, but they had questions later. So I would implore you, I'll be around for the rest of the day. Please tag me on Twitter if you have any questions while you're experimenting. So why we're all here right now as developers is because of these two things. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in the course of dealing with very large clients and very small ones, I've got the question of, do you know how to build this? Well, before I answered, I'm very eager. I tend to be very curious, and my answer wants to be yes right away. But saying yes to somebody who wants you to build a skill for their kid to play with on the weekends is different from a corporation who wants to make money off of it. A little different. But luckily, I've spent the past almost 10 years now working in the enterprise space. I do come from the .NET world, but I have huge love for Androids, so you are also my people. All right, so when I was trying to decide whether or not to invest additional time on top of all the other things coming out, all the new extensions to our IDEs, why should I spend any more of my precious mental resources on this was because of two different pieces of data that I got from Gartner. This one right here was pretty compelling. That by 2021, more than 50% of enterprise companies will spend more annually on bots and chatbot creation than traditional mobile app development. Now, this mattered to me because at the time I read this, I was working as a mobile developer. So I kind of cared about this. The second piece of data that I felt was really compelling actually came out just recently and kind of catapulted me into doing more and more. And that is that the report this year stated that the spending on these virtual assistant devices would top $3.5 billion by then. That's a lot. And of course, 25% of those 2 years later would be employee interactions via voice. So that's like business to business, or at least internal kind of applications. So that's separate from just having a fun voice skill that you can do a game with. This was like real work that could be done. So now it was starting to feel like voice development should be something that any one of us as developers should have in our toolkit. That's my opinion. Especially once I found out what it was like to develop for it. But instead of just giving you a summary of what those things were, I figured I'd take you through my journey as to what it took for me to actually build for both of these platforms and what I have for and against each one of these. Yes, this is largely opinion-driven, but I have built dozens of these, and who doesn't love a good battle story, right? All right, let's start with the questions. When I first started getting going on this, I was told that we needed to support both. And if there's anything I learned from mobile app development, you can't really choose when usually there's you and another developer for like iOS, or you have to learn how to do both of them, or you have to do some third-party framework, right? We are all used to this. So borrowing from the lessons then, I kind of accepted that I'd have to program for both Google Assistant and Alexa. So my questions were driven by how much they could share in my development work, okay? So my questions were, how does this skill even work in the first place? Where do we program it? Like, where does it live? What concepts do I need to know that are different from any of the other backend or API work that I've done before, or even client-level work? What about debugging and testing? Nobody really talked about it a whole lot online, and that's always a fun discovery. How do you make just a basic skill with a web service? Can you? How is it done? Can it take dynamic user input? Like not just an expected input, but can it take anything that comes off the top of their head? What about expressiveness? Do I have any control whatsoever on the style of delivery, which becomes really important whenever the skill represents a brand, like a specific brand that may have a quirky personality, they may have a more serious personality, and they want to make sure that certain emphasis on certain words come across. How much control do we really have over that? Can the responses be updated by people other than the developer? Because I love coding. This is one of my favorite things to do. I do it voluntarily outside of my job, but I would like to not be woken up at 2 in the morning because they chose the wrong word in a sentence, and I now need to go back and update it. Can someone else be doing that? And then, of course, can I change the responses based on that input? Does every response have to be scripted? So that's a lot of questions that I had right away, and nobody was there to actually answer them. Because when I first entered into this, it was largely considered just kind of a fad, something that is kind of fun, but would go away. A lot like VR for business, right? It's fun, but not a lot of people are really going to use it unless you're in the military or you happen to have specific kind of a business need for it. Most businesses aren't going to use it every day. But once that started changing, and I started seeing so many client requests come in for it, these were the questions I had. So hopefully, if you have additional questions into these, ping me later, and I'll add to my nice little list. All right. Of course, lastly, what should we keep in mind as voice developers? Now, I say voice developers just so that it's inclusive of you, but really any developer should be able to do this. That's my mantra. All of us should be able to build for voice. Let's start with the answer to the first question. How does this skill even work? I'm going to make no assumptions since I don't know how many of you have actually built in this. So it's important to understand the terminology difference. One ecosystem calls something one thing, the other decides to be special and call the exact same thing something else entirely, right? And this is no different. Amazon and Google did not necessarily see eye to eye in almost any of their naming conventions for voice. So I kind of have put a lot of slashes so you understand what I'm talking about. First is, where's the user interaction? Traditionally, on these devices, this would be an Amazon Echo device. The specific one is the Echo Dot, and it's the latest generation. So it's the most recent one. And of course, this is the Google Home Mini. They have different incarnations of them, but really, when we're talking about user interactions, they either call it devices or surfaces. Google calls it a surface, and then Amazon calls it a device. All right, the next thing you need to understand is that this is a NLP-powered conversation. That means that on one side, that would be Alexa, and the other one would be Google Assistant. I'm trying to separate what is what, because that wasn't initially obvious to me. I just called this an Alexa device, which is partially true, but it's not. Technically, Alexa could work in your car if you wanted it to, okay? That's just the NLP-powered conversation aspect of this ecosystem. All right, you follow me? And then the last one is the capabilities or the skills. The cool thing about doing things on Google is that you can hook in very easily to their entire suite of products. Very easily to do. Like, for instance, reading your Gmail aloud. That's something that I can do rather easily, whereas I'd have to probably write or use separate SDK in order to have that work on Alexa. Does that make sense? In terms of ecosystems, obviously, Google has a huge presence on Android. And while Amazon does have a presence in their Kindle tablets, it's not nearly as popular as all the Android phones walking around, right? Which is why last year, Amazon came out with the ability for you to use Alexa through the helper application that you can download from the Play Store, right? It's the same thing will work on iOS as well, so Apple's not completely left out in this. So now technically you can use any one of those NLP powered conversations on almost any device. But it's just important to understand that when I say device or surface, I'm talking about they're specifically made for the home devices. You with me? Okay, cool. All right. These are oversimplified, but this is pretty much how it goes. Again, I make no assumptions that you know how the conversation truly happens. A user starts by asking a question. This is a relatively dumb device. There isn't really a lot going on here. I know that the media would like to have you think differently, but it really is just a speaker and a glorified Raspberry Pi. Okay, just pretty much just sends things up to the cloud once it listens just for its wake word, and then waits for a response from the cloud. So there really isn't much of anything on here. The memory is almost nothing on this device. There is a little bit, but not a lot. Okay, so you can actually, if you're interested, I don't know how much of you are network people, you can actually sniff the traffic and see how much is actually getting sent up and when it's happening. So I did that at a hackathon to see like how much it was actually listening. Turns out that periodically Google would send something up, but Amazon almost never did. It was just waiting for that command. Make sense? So now that you understand that, really, this is a cloud-connected device. It can't really do anything on its own. Okay? So once it goes through there, then in the ecosystem up there, whether it's Dialogflow, which is also Google Action, or if it's like Alexa's NLP ecosystem, it makes a decision which one of the skills to send an additional JSON request to, and then you get to send it right back to that ecosystem that will then disperse it down to the device that will then speak out loud to the user. Okay? It's not really all that complicated, but it's important that you know where you can affect the steps. Okay? You can affect the steps once you get the request, and you can affect a little bit of what the user knows ahead of time, but that's about it. Everything else goes through their proprietary ecosystems. You with me? Cool. That means that when you say, Alexa, tell me what time it is, that is Amazon's skill, or that's Amazon's default skill, which might be weather.com or NOAA, depending on where you are in the world. For Google, they have their own data systems for that as well. So if you want to talk to like a special skill that you do for weather. Like I'm a huge tornado chaser because I come from Kansas, so I might want to know what the weather's like today, but only really in the context of tornadoes. I might say, Alexa, ask the name of my skill, what's the weather like today? Because you have to be specific. Otherwise, you're basically sending an envelope to Amazon or Google, and it doesn't know where else to go. Make sense? Cool. So if you've ever wondered why this one skill works but that one doesn't, make sure you do the name of it. It's not dissimilar for, this kind of flow is not dissimilar for Google Assistant, but if you notice, it's kind of encapsulated here within something called a conversation action, or Google Action. So Google Actions do more than just Google Assistant. They can do many other things, like do sort of like timer jobs and requests. It's kind of really fun. You just have to understand that you have to go one level deeper in order to really get the dialogue situated, okay? Whereas the entire purpose behind what Alexa does is to do that. So it's a little bit more straightforward than Google. Google is a humongous ecosystem that is awesome and has a lot of power. So just understand that you need to invoke an action that will eventually go through an invocation trigger through Dialogflow in order to get you that knock on the door that you need to fulfill that request. Okay? Cool. This is just an example of a similar kind of a service that is sent to like a smart home kind of a skill. Smart home meaning the original reason that they built these devices were to go in your home, right? I travel all the time, so that's not very practical. So my room name is always backpack whenever I bring them with me. Because, I mean, they do travel with me and I have to deal with resetting the Wi-Fi all the time. But by and large, it's to remotely change or alter something like a light switch or a temperature gauge in your home. A smart home skill does not need any vocal response. It just needs you to go do the thing. So this is a fire and forget kind of a skill. Amazon doesn't require you to send them a response. It just tells you, hey, they said to turn the light on. Hey, they said to turn the light off. You don't have to formulate a response that is spoken. You just go and do the thing, whether that is turn that light on or raise your fleet of drones in the air, whatever you'd like to do. And of course, this is kind of a fun little outline of what I did with some high schoolers recently, which is to use if this, then that. Has anybody ever used if this, then that? It's awesome. It's great for prototyping, and sometimes it just works, and you don't really need to do a whole lot more than that. But this worked really well for things like a Roomba, like the little robotic vacuum cleaners. We did something with this where it would, Google Assistant would turn it on and also play actual Roomba music while it's going. Something that was silly but really fun, and they got a kick out of it. And they didn't really require a whole lot of programming. And all this stuff sounds really fun, but how practical is that really for going back and forth with the user where you need some real information? This is kind of what it would be like for Alexa, a little bit more in depth. Remember how we started with the customer asking a question, then Alexa has to identify your skills name and analyzes and understands what the user says and does a speech-to-text analysis, which, by the way, is the reason you're using this ecosystem, so you don't have to do that. And then it knocks on your door, and you can send it a response. If you notice, we've got two things here, okay? So now this is voice, right? This is all you really need. This is the only mandatory part of your response, this right here. But you have an option to also send a visual response in addition, okay? So this is kind of like a summary of whatever was said, or maybe something that would be meaningful to have written down and the user wants to go refer to later. This really works well for things like a picture of a step in a recipe. So Google Assistant might say, hey, this is how you do this one step, and inside of the Home app, you can actually see a response with a picture of what that step looks like. That's one example. That does require the user to also be looking at their phone, so that, that's two devices, but you at least have the option. I've used this very successfully for things like directions that are summarized at the end, or appointment setting. Okay, you're good to go. We've set your appointment for this time, this date, and then it kind of sends it, instead of a push notification, it's just sent to the voice app that is on your phone. So you just have it in perpetuity. You can always look at it, okay? So you do have this option for Alexa to do that. You'll have the same thing for Google Assistant. I kind of like this slide a little better. I think it looks a little prettier off their website. But what I like about this is it kind of draws the parallels of what the steps really are. Whereas once you go through the device, you actually are dealing directly with the NLP engine in front of TensorFlow, okay? That's really what is analyzing whatever your user says, and then it hands it off to an action, okay? And then, of course, you could certainly save that information before you turn around and send a response. But what we found is that context was a little lacking. Is that nothing was saved. There was no turn-by-turn conversation that was happening inherently within the action. So that is when Google acquired something called API.ai that is now known as TensorFlow. And that step right in between does state management and slot management as well. So instead of you having to worry about state management on your side of the service, it actually does it for you. It's very straightforward. I like it a lot. So that's just a way that, so sometimes interchangeably, people will say Dialogflow versus Google Action. You have to use both in order to build for Google Assistant. Are we clear? So you can build independently just a back and forth conversation in Dialogflow that you use in a JavaScript website somewhere for a chatbot that has nothing to do with Google Action. You can also independently create Google Action, which is really just a trigger to make things happen independently of Dialogflow, but you need them to work together in order for this to actually work for Google Assistant. Whereas there is no version of Dialogflow for Amazon's Alexa. That's just not in there. There's like a little bit of a light version of like responses that are starting to get developed, but by and large, Amazon expects you to be in charge of state management. Okay? All right. Hopefully everybody's with me. Good deal. All right. So next question was, if this will work. Please work? Maybe? Okay, I'll just push the button. Where do we program it? Oh, I think I just killed all of the clickers. I did. It's okay. I can push the button. All right, so where do we program it? I didn't understand exactly, if this is a cloud-enabled device, how I was supposed to test this thing. That's not as easy as I expected it to be. There's any sort of real sophistication to them. So do I even really need these devices? So the first thing I started with was something called Alexa Voice Service and Google's Conversation API. You can use these today. What this does is these APIs take in streaming audio, and then you are leveraging their NLP engine to determine what is said. Okay? There's lots of other libraries for that as well, but if you want to use these ecosystems, then I would suggest that you do, because most users have one of the two or both. This is how you would do something. Let's say you build an AR app and you want to be able to talk to Google Assistant or to Alexa while you're doing some sort of game or what have you. As long as you've got access to the audio and the device to the user, you can stream that directly to these APIs, and they will give you text responses. Like it's all just voice-to-text analysis, and you can go from there. But there's a lot of like, how do I get it to be a more sophisticated skill? It felt like it was too open-ended. Like I didn't really want to be an audio engineer. I wanted to really understand where responses started and ended, and I wanted to be able to keep track a little bit more of where we were in the conversation. Luckily for both of us, there was a template for what it meant to build a basic skill. And those templates are these two things. So Alexa Skills Kit, or the Ask SDK, is a templatized approach to building skills only for Amazon devices. So not like in your car, but only on their devices. And Dialogflow will kind of templatize the same approach for their devices only. Make sense? Cool. All right, this is what it looks like when you first log in. I certainly have both of these websites up right now. I was playing with earlier, but just for the sake of not trusting internet, I always put them on a slide. So you too can also look at these slides later. I will tweet them out. But this just kind of shows you how much simpler it's gotten over the years. About every 2 to 3 months, Amazon changes their portal, so don't get used to it. But what I do like about it right now is it's pretty obvious what you can do. You can add an intent, a slot type. You can look at ways to get started. There's the specific JSON code editor right there. They have built into to the browser for you. And then here are some of the default intents it comes with and any definitions of that. It shows ways you can save your model, build it, any information about your skill, etc. It's pretty straightforward. As straightforward as this is, it's not as nice as Dialogflow. To me, that looks even better. Very, very, very easy. This shows a summary of my intents. I don't even have to click on anything in order to look at it. It already shows it right here in the front. And then any entities, training, integrations, and fulfillment. Notice how none of the descriptions of these categories have the same name at all, except for intents. So at least we've got that going for us. All right. And I was excited when I messed around with Dialogflow to discover that there are many different integrations you can do with this platform. All over the place. You can do things with Twilio, you can do things with Skype, but I noticed down at the bottom that there seemed to be an integration with Amazon Alexa, but it didn't really have a slider button. That's because they are a competitor to Amazon, and they are not interested in doing direct, easy, live integrations with it. So you have to export. Anytime you change the structure of your back and forth dialogue, you have to export it and then upload it separately to Amazon's portal. So that didn't sound like it was all that friendly to me for being the conversation management tool across both. It would be for one, but maybe not the other. So how would I deal with that? So now that I was like, okay, well then, what are the concepts that I even have to know in order to make a decision about where to manage the actual conversational structure, right? To me, this was supposed to be really easy. It's supposed to be back and forth, fire, back and forth. But there's actually a lot more to this. So a little bit of a disclaimer. I am not a designer. I'm not a UX designer. I'm not a UI designer. I'm a developer. I'm a back-end developer. I love being in business logic, and I love doing things right at the engine level, you know? But I discovered that because there is no visual UI, there really normally would not be any sort of experienced person that would be assigned to a project like this. It would just all be me. It would just all be the developer. So there's a little bit of a decision to make as to how you even think about building a skill to begin with. And when I started looking into what it took to do this, I stumbled upon a great YouTube video in about 2017 at Google I/O from James Giangola. If you haven't heard of him, he is fantastic. He's in charge of their entire voice experience platform. And he mentioned something called Grice's maxims. Now, again, not a designer, not a developer, but these were straightforward objectives that I could really digest and understand as I was basically designing the back and forth experience with my user. If you follow these 4 things, these tended to be, across the board, what all of the top skills on both platforms had in common to be really successful and get a lot of users that didn't hate their skill, right? The first one was to be truthful with your user and not use it completely as a sales platform. While you may not, as the developer, get the choice for that, it's important to use this as a good example of the right way to get people to actually use this back and forth conversation. It needs to be brief. I've seen a lot of skills that have a novel as a response, very, very long. Unfortunately, you already have less than half of someone's focus because you have no screen in front of them. You just have voice. They could be tying their shoe, they could be drawing on something, they could be cooking dinner, they could be wrangling children and still be asking your skill questions. So you already have a diminished focus. And it's important that you don't expect the listener to just be very attentive for long periods of time. So be brief with your skills. The third one, of course, is to be relevant. So if somebody asks you specifically, I need a recipe for using this particular cut of beef, that you don't start off into a tangent about pork or about how they should go vegan. Like, it's important that you respond in a relevant way so that you're actually helpful to the user. And of course, lastly, be very clear as to whatever response you give. If you don't have enough information from the user to do something, ask a clarifying question, but also make sure you remind them about something that you did understand. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a second. That brings me to the cooperative principle. Has anybody ever heard of this principle before? I have a whole room of people who don't know. This is great. Okay, let's think about it more like developers, shall we? I think this is probably a better way to explain it. So I'm used to Happy Path. Happy Path is me setting up tests. It depends on whether or not you do test-driven development or not. But back in the day when I didn't do test-driven development, I just wrote the Happy Path. This is what I wanted to do. I'll do all the edge cases later, but I just need it to do this thing, which we all know sometimes becomes the only thing that gets programmed. And so oftentimes, skills fall victim to the Happy Path mentality. They expect a user to say, set an alarm. And then you'll come back and say, okay, for when? And they give you exactly all the information you need to go do your job, and everybody's happy. But in reality, I'm exhausted at 4 in the morning, and I may not be all that cognizant of the time I need to leave for work. I set 2 alarms, one to wake up and one to make sure you get out the door, Heather, and you got a meeting. So it's better to be able to digest pieces of information in order to completely satisfy your function. So I'm thinking about, if I look at this as a piece of code, everything needs to be optional. All the inputs need to be optional. You need to, inside of your function, determine how many of those 3 or 4 pieces of information did they actually give you. And then whatever they've given you, keep that, don't re-ask them. So keep that and say, great, I see that it's on Tuesday, but what time? You know, make sure you respond in a way that proves that you listened, or at least the device listened to the user. That's where the trust and the real like assistant feel comes in. We want much more of a Jarvis and a lot less of the phone company where you go 8 levels deep and you made a mistake in a response and all of a sudden it kicks you back to the beginning, right? We want more of a Jarvis. And it's actually not that bad to program, but it does require you to restructure your code a little bit. Because the user may not give you exactly what you want because they don't have a menu option in front of them. They don't have a choose this or that unless you've explicitly told them to do that. They may not give you everything. So just remember when you're writing your functions, they just may not give you every value. And that's okay. That just is also an opportunity to look historically at your interactions and see if there's a place where you could improve the experience. Make sense? You guys with me? Cool. That brings me to conversational implicature. So I'm fascinated more and more by the way that humans are able to communicate very little with actual words. A lot of it has to do with our body language and the mood of the room, and some of it is very visual. But while I was in Oslo late last year, this was a real conversation that happened that I was watching. And my friend Jacob said that he really needed a drink. So my friend Todd responded, well, have you been to the Scotsman? When I was sitting there listening to this, I realized that a lot had transpired in there that was an assumption. What happens if Todd wasn't really Todd, if Todd was a voice assistant skill that you had to build? Okay? What just happened there? A lot had been assumed. It implies that the Scotsman serves drinks, right? And that the drinks are alcoholic, because most people don't say, oh, I really need a drink when they want water. I mean, I guess it depends on your culture, but at least in my culture, when someone says, I really need a drink, they usually mean alcohol. It also means that the Scotsman's currently open for business, because why would Todd say, this is a place that you should go when they aren't open on Mondays or Tuesdays, right? It also means that it might be, well, this thing is just not responding very quickly. Please. There's one more. It's nearby. There we go. Because why would Todd respond with something that is in Timbuktu? Makes no sense. And of course, it might be a place that a third-party person might like who's in the room, but who has also said nothing but was sitting at the table. That would be me. Right? So, because he also knows I like Scotch, so probably would like this place. That's a lot of assumptions for a developer to have to make. The user asks them a question like, I really need a drink. That's a lot. But really, we have a lot of this information, if you think about it. My example here is this. I think Google probably does the best job of it because of their vast amounts of data that they collect. But when I arrived in Stockholm, I asked the question, where is the nearest Apple store? Because I needed a whole bunch of new adapters for this thing. And not only did it know where the nearest one was, it knew where the nearest one was in relation to where I was because it was tracking my location. And it wasn't scary to me because it was useful at the time. It found the nearest one, and not only did it find the nearest one, I didn't have to translate it into Swedish in order for it to find it. Google translated it and goes, oh, Apple something, and then, okay, yeah, this kind of store. And it gave me an accurate response and said that it opened at 10 o'clock on this day. So the value to me was such that I did not mind the leverage of previously known data. Don't be afraid to do the same thing for your users. Make sure it's clear to them that that is what you're doing. But the reason that I would say this is because probably one of the best experiences I had for voice is being able to do what is almost like a 2-click purchase experience. I am a huge pizza person, so we have a a whole bunch of different competitors. One of them specifically that I really like is Domino's Pizza in the United States, and they've got a really great online experience, and that's great. But if I'm watching Game of Thrones, I'm not really interested in going through your website or your mobile app and your 15 steps so that I can get food because I'm right in the middle of something, especially if I can't stop it because it's a room full of people and nobody wants me to stop it, okay? So what I'd rather do is say something like, Alexa, tell Domino's Pizza I want to order a pizza. The response is, great. Do you want your usual? And I say yes. And then the next thing that's said is that, okay, it'll be there in 20 minutes. End of conversation. All that is because it was designed around conversational implicature, because I've already purchased something through them before, so a method of payment is already in their database. I don't need to go through that whole thing again, okay? They've already seen what my favorite order is. I don't need to go through that again. And there are a lot of options for different kinds of pizzas, for this topping and that topping. Does voice work really well for the first time purchase? No. But for repeat purchases, absolutely. It is faster to say something with your voice than to fire up an app and log in and then go through your whole back and forth, okay? Even if you have a very tight experience around your flow for mobile, you're not going to beat that kind of back and forth in voice. I didn't have to log in at all because it was already logged in and the account was linked with my voice device, right? This is where you start to see why so many of the larger enterprise companies are interested in this. Because if you can get your users in the moment where they really want something, which is why Amazon's so successful with Prime, then why can't it also be leveraged for them as well, right? So this is why it starts to become more relevant to us as enterprise-level developers. Okay, so hopefully everybody's with me as to the whys and the approach. Let's go over some terminology. Cool, intents. In case you're not sure what that is, you have to think about them as events. Events that fire, the intention behind what the user says. The reason why it's called an intent is because there are many ways that a user can say something, but this is the intended reason, okay? And that's usually a kind of like however you would name your object, that is the intent that is represented, the one-to-many relationship behind that. This is a basic structure in JSON of what it would look like for at least this one's Alexa. I'm just going to show you right here. So if you'll notice, inside of your interaction model, your language model, the language could be Dutch, it could be English, and then the invocation name is the name of your skill. Inside of intents, the name of this intent is Jedi Mind Trick Intent. I named it that. I could have named it whatever I wanted. But that's my identifier for this part of the flow. Okay, so that right there is my trigger for everything else that I do in code, okay? And these are some slots. These are some things that the user could say that it takes in. I know I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it also shows a secondary area of samples. Sample this is part of the way that machine learning algorithm is used in both TensorFlow and in Lex, which is what powers Alexa, in order to kind of train that recognition algorithm, okay? You provide it the initial samples, it does get better over time, and you don't have to provide more. This just gives it a nice little shove out the door. The other, I don't know why I keep picking this up. I know it doesn't work. Okay. The next one is sample utterances. You just kind of think about it as many versions, okay? That one-to-many relationship that I was talking about before. You need to provide several, at least 4 or 5, because depending culturally on where you're from, even within your country, people can say things in a different way, but really mean the same thing, right? I know it for sure is that way in the Deep South in the States. I'm from the Midwest right now, but I originally was from California, and there's a whole lot of slang that happens in that part of the States. And so I needed to take some of that into consideration depending on where the people lived that tended to use the skill. So I would have like the way somebody would say it if they were 14, the way somebody would say it if they're in a rush, the way, I would just add. But really, all I cared about was the intent. So this is the mapping that happens there. Okay, the next one is the invocation name. So this is just the name of your skill that the user would say. It doesn't have to be the full name of your skill, because I know that some names of corporations can be this long, but this is just the name of the skill itself that the user takes. Last is endpoint or fulfillment. They're the same thing. All that really means is that they need a URL from which they can hit you with their request. You do not get to reach out to their platforms. This is a request-only experience. You have to wait for them to reach out to you. So you have to provide both of these ecosystems with where they can go hit your endpoint. This is what it would look like to set it up instead of doing something like a... So like, has anybody here used Lambda before? A couple of you? Or like an Azure function? Maybe a few? So that's where, you know, a lot of the host providers would like you to just go ahead and use those for these kinds of skills, but a lot of my clients just wanted to extend their existing REST service. Just add another endpoint and be able to handle some of these inputs. And that is where you would put it for Alexa. This is where you would put it for Google Assistant. There's also an inline option for Firebase for those of you who want to mess around really quickly with that. This is an option within the Dialogflow ecosystem as well. Last is portal configuration. Make sure that you understand where everything is before you go there. If you're interested in how to kind of decipher all the options, there's some documentation for each one. One is for developer.alexa.com, and actions on Google is developers.google.com/actions. That's a lot. OK, so what about debugging and testing? You know, what about that? The answer really is twofold. If you are OK with just creating a tunnel through ngrok to your computer, be my guest. But I work for a security company, and they're not really interested in that. So instead, I chose to do remote debugging through the host provider. I think for Elastic Beanstalk for Java, I had to look it up because it's been a minute. You can enable remote debugging that you can use within Eclipse. And every time it's thrown over the fence, you can catch it within your code, and you can debug that way. The same thing with within Eclipse, you can do an Azure web app as well. Those are the two major ones. I know that there are many other options, but this right here has saved my life with debugging, especially once it's out in staging, and I'm trying to decipher what QA is looking at. But that's the only way that you can really debug. That means that separately, you can test your own service, you know, separate from it. But if you want to truly test the whole connected experience, you have to do it with remote debugging, or you have to open a tunnel to your computer, and that's not fun. So this is the best way that you can do it quickly. OK, so let's see if I can get over here. All right. So really, what do you really need in order to make this are 4 things. You just need a REST API endpoint that takes a JSON formatted request, that returns a JSON formatted response, and ensure that your request only comes from those 2 ecosystems. That is the extent of you building a skill. I know I gave you all this prefacing, but so much of the documentation references all of this terminology that I had to explain it first. So you kind of know what you're looking for before you go into the documentation. I would say between the 2, Google's more powerful, Alexa's more clear. As a developer, you can build a skill very quickly on Alexa. It's very obvious and it's well documented. The thing about Google is that they acquired API.ai before it became Dialogflow, and they haven't really caught up with their docs yet. So you have to kind of sometimes find things in a forum, sometimes find things over here. And it just takes a little bit longer to find the answers. But once you do, you certainly have way more languages and options than you do on Alexa. Good. If you're interested in where to find these, there is an SDK for Java, for Alexa, and there's also an unofficial Google Actions Java SDK if you do not want to create just these plain old Java objects yourself. But really, when you think about it, all it is JSON. Back and forth that you're setting up. And I'm not really in love with SDKs because both of these JSON structures change so frequently because they're constantly updating them that I find it's just easier to capture it myself, create my object that I know I'll use. But if you'd like to just not have to worry about creating all of that, those SDKs do exist for you. I understand that this particular example is in .NET. Please don't hate me, but I didn't really know how to do, if you guys wanted me to do it in Kotlin, if you wanted me to do it in what. So I decided I'll just show it to you. It's pretty close. All this is a dynamic object I'm returning. The reason I'm showing this to you is this is the least amount of code that it takes to fire this. I don't have to do any more than that. That's it for Alexa, and that's it for Google Assistant. That's all it needs in order to deliver a voice response. That's it. So you see, it's not really that scary. You just had to understand where everything lived and what it's called. But really, it's just like any other API. The difference is you're telling it what to say on a device. If you're interested in testing this stuff and you don't have either one of these devices, fear not. They both have simulators that work pretty well. And I think if you're interested in either one of those, there's a test tab for Alexa, and there is kind of like a two-step kind of like a webhook fulfillment that you have to then test, and then it jumps you over to Google Assistant. But it's really not too bad. I think it's pretty good. All right. I know I have 5 minutes. I'm going to try to wrap up really quick. Can it take dynamic user input? Yes. For Alexa, it's called a search query. That means that you just take in whatever the user says up to 7 words, and it does direct speech to text. That's it. It doesn't do anything else, any other kinds of mapping to a list that you might provide. It just does straight speech to text. The same thing will happen for Google Assistant as well. If you're interested, though, in not having it be open to interpretation, and you really think it's close enough, but really you want it to be a match in a predefined list, this would be a good example. Like state an intent where you want like a horoscope for this sign. We know that there are predetermined lists of horoscope names. So if a user says something pretty close to it, both of these ecosystems are smart enough to match it only to one of those. If it's totally outside of the circle and you say something that is not related to that predetermined list, it'll say it doesn't understand. But in general, if you sort of say, even with an accent, say Virgo or Scorpio or whatever it is, it'll match it a lot better if you give it a predefined list. Okay? But you don't have to. You can do either one. What I thought was really fun is something that's called, I call it a Jedi mind trick. This is just a regurgitated back and forth conversation. It's a wildcard. So I tell it to say whatever the user just said. Sometimes it's kind of funny because it doesn't always work great, but we're going to try it, shall we? Okay. Alexa, start Jedi Master.
I'm ready to become a Jedi like you.
Say hello, J-Focus.
Hello, J-Focus.
Right. So you see, that's nothing. This right here is a piece of JavaScript that pretty much
Say
does
help to hear a list of options or cancel to
sorry.
exit.
At least once that's happened. Cancel. Cancel. Maybe. Cancel.
Don't do this, Google. Please don't go this way.
Cancel.
May the force be with you.
There we go. I mean, it has to happen at least once, right? So that's all I'm doing here is I'm just taking in whatever the value was of that slot that the user gave me, and I'm just regurgitating it. There's lots of ways you can do it. So really, when it comes to there's so much more I want to share, and I have all of this slide deck completely online as well. When we talk about expression, something that is interesting to me is that we've had specs for voice expression for 15 years. Did you know that? I had no idea. But if you go on W3, this is an example of SSML, which is Speech Synthesis Markup Language. This is HTML and CSS for your voice. And this is where all your front-end developers can go. Go work on it. This is fantastic. The example that I have online is where I turn Google Assistant into Kylo Ren, and then she becomes Rey, and they kind of talk back and forth, and I lower his pitch and raise hers up a little bit. And it's really fun to do. If you're interested in the official specs for that, it's on W3. So please go check it out. All right, and then I had this demo, but the last thing is keeping track of contextual conversation. Remember how I mentioned that Dialogflow does that for you, but there isn't one for Alexa. But there's another option you have, and both of these platforms provide it, is an attribute kind of a thing that you can just stick in a key value pair at random as you're going through your skill, and instead of just always hitting your database to figure out where you are in the conversation, you can actually just keep appending and adding attributes as you go, as long as the session is alive. So that's a little helpful as you go. Last one is, can the responses be updated by non-developers? Yes, look at a CMS. Those are great. And yes, use all of the analytics APIs that are out there. I'm so sorry. I wish I had more time. But thank you guys so much for listening to me ramble on about everything. And as always, stay curious.